Can everybody hear me? Well, my name is Maurice Baker. Everybody calls me Mo. I was almost called Monday. When I was born, I only weighed 2 pounds at Jessop's Hospital. I was in an incubator for many weeks. The nurses called me Rabbit because I looked like a skinned rabbit. The way that I nearly got called Monday was because when my dad came to see me the first time, he looked in the incubator and he turned to my mum and said, "I think we better call it a day." Here we go then. Dinnington and Anston. Forgive me for having to read my notes, but relying on my memory is not a good idea. At the top of this hill, when I can find my button, that little wood is on Lakeland Drive, and that's where the shop is on Lakeland Drive. So it's up the hill. The photo shows the location of a Neolithic long barrow burial cairn, and that's where the small wood is. In the Neolithic period, remains of the dead were placed in a large earth mound up to 70 metres in length, known as a long barrow. And there was one here, 50 metres in length. That's what it would have looked like. And that's where it is today. All that wood was the burial mound. About 6,500 years ago, some people in this area learned how to farm as opposed to hunting. But it took 3,000 more years before farming became the main way of life. People settled to look after their animals and crops. The first dwellings they built were wood and stone houses with moss or thatched roofs. These skulls were found in this mound at Dinnington. Both skulls were male. I took this photo of them in Clifton Park Museum. The long barrow was excavated in 1862 by Squire Aythorpe in order to use the stones for building, as the stones were quite regular size. Archaeologists from Oxford came and performed the excavation. The remaining contents are now in the Oxford University Museum. This was then part of the White Quarry plantation, and up to 24 skeletons were found in the centre in a seated position. Mostly they were old men, and there was one towards one end. We don't know why. Now a skull was found by some local lads who played football with it. Then they took it up to the hall at Dinnington and lit a candle inside it in front of Miss Aythorpe's window. Miss Aythorpe saw it and fainted with fright. Early Saxon houses were built as a single room with a thatched roof. There was a hole in the middle to relieve the smoke from the fire that was in a pit in the centre of the floor. The warmest place in the house was in the thatched roof, and the dogs, cats and various other creatures would climb up and sleep under the thatch. When the rain was so heavy that it came through the thatch, the animals would jump down. And so when rain is really heavy, we say it's raining cats and dogs. This is the oldest wall in Dinnington, a Saxon cottage wall embedded in the more recent wall of Falcon Cottage. It comprises various types of stone and also some bricks, so the builder obviously gathered whatever he could find. This photo was taken from the former Royal Elephant car park. There's another one. That's a bit blurred, and I've exaggerated the cement in between the stone for clarity. On the subject of building houses, I was asked a question that I couldn't answer. So I investigated. This was about the barn conversion that is opposite St James's Church in South Anston. Someone passing the building, which is right up alongside the pavement, had noticed that the mortar between the stonework contained small pieces of coloured glass. These were only very small pieces, but visible at the exposed surface of the mortar. I called at Wrighton DIY and asked Kevin the same question. Kevin's theory is that because stone buildings are built with grit sand, this would have been very expensive to transport in, as our surrounding materials are soft sand or limestone. The theory was that someone had found a way to crush glass like bottles, etc., to mix with ordinary sand. I found out only recently that many years ago Worksop Council were already recycling, and they had a machine for that very purpose of making grit sand from crushing glass. There was a possible supply from the glassworks as well. Problem solved. Anston cum Membris, to give Anston its full name title, as a whole of two parts, north and south. In 1839, the population of Anston was 840. 100 years later, the population was 2,293. It comprised 3,845 acres of land and 7 acres of water. It rises from 200 feet above sea level to 400 feet above sea level. And I think that's when the tide is in at Mablethorpe. It's hard to comprehend, but the stone in Anston is comprised of sea creatures and marine organisms. The original access to North Anston from the works up Sheffield Road was not Wrighton Road, as that was just a field track with a footbridge over the brook. Later improved and named Church Bridge. That's how it used to be. The only true access to North Anston was over flat stones placed in the brook at the bottom of Main Street and what is now Mill Lane. This was called a rack ford. So, as this was the main route into North Anston, it became Main Street. Eventually a bridge was built, Shepherd's Bridge, and at the side of it a steam mill was built, powered by water pumped from the brook, which is also the boundary between North and South Anston. South Anston was originally called Church Anston, and North Anston was called Chapel Anston. Many people think that the River Wrighton flows through Anston. The River Wrighton does not flow through Anston. The now named Anston Brook flows through Anston and on into Mill Pond in Lindrick Dale, and then joined by other tributaries, it flows out of the pond and becomes the River Wrighton. Anston Brook was originally called the Stones Dyke. That's Anston railway station. And that's Anston railway station. And that's Anston railway station, but there was only one. When Dinnington Pit was being sunk in 1902, the railway was built to serve the pit. That was the engine that they started building the railway with. It wasn't until the 12th of May 1912 that it was first used for passengers, when the station was built at the side of Mill Lane, so 113 years ago today. Anston Station staff, Walter Beecroft on the left. He lost a leg in the Great War, but went on to become a signalman on the railway. And this is the first passenger train that went to Anston station. During the Second World War, the station was dismantled and moved in its entirety to Scotland for the use of troop movements. Anston Windmill. I'm going to read a piece that was shared to me by Marion Burbridge. Some of you might know Marion. In Marion's words, my great-great-great-grandfather Samuel Gilbert was the master miller at North Anston Windmill. In the 1851 census, his wife was Elizabeth, and they had 3 children, Mary Jane, Jane Elizabeth, and William. So we can presume the windmill was already built by the mid-1800s, and it survived until its demolition in 1937. The windmill stood in what was known as Bell's Field off Woodsets Road, where Windmill Court now stands. The family lived in a cottage on Main Street after St Mary's Cottages, opposite to where Anston Club now stands. The family lived in the middle cottage, number 3, and the other 2 cottages were occupied by a family called Wilcox, and at the other side lived the Shipston family. The work of the miller was especially hard and hazardous in those days, with sacks of corn and flour being very heavy, along with the dusty environment, dusty miller. This caused health problems and breathing disorders. I don't know of Samuel's health condition, but he lived to the age of 69. The miller's income came in the form of flour, with the farmer taking his corn yield to the miller, and a ton of corn that had been milled equalled so many bags of flour paid to the miller. A rough guide is that the mill could grind 40 sacks or more per day. That would be about 5 tons of flour. In Samuel's case, he took the flour home to his cottage where his wife Elizabeth baked bread, cakes and scones, and the front room of their cottage became the local bakery. That's looking along Main Street from Ryton Road. In the notes left by my mum when she died was the story that on the days that Elizabeth made and sold her toffee apples, they were so popular that people would walk from miles around to buy them. That's the derelict mill in 1930. On a windy day in 1936, the farmer was working in the next field. He went home for lunch, and when he returned, the mill had completely collapsed, and carved on the great oak central support was the build date of 1720. There was another mill not far away, but this didn't have the stone-built base for storage as the first one did. And I've now come across this map where the fields are named, and there are 3 fields in the area named Windmill Field. So far, no photographs of the 3rd mill have turned up. How did we get rid of our household waste? I can remember these dustbin lorries. I had a green dinky toy one. This was when the bin men collected your bin from your yard, carried it to the lorry, emptied it and took it back afterwards. But what happened before the motorised bin lorries? Household waste was collected by horse and cart and delivered to the sewage works down Church Lane in Dinnington. Here it was incinerated in a coal-fired incinerator called the Destructor, resulting in what was called clinker. This was used to repair footpaths and byroads. Walnut Drive off Nursery Road was made with this, and we referred to it as the cinder track. So what happened before the incinerator came? Everyone dug a hole in the ground, and this was called an ash pit. Ashes from the fire were placed in the pit. Most other waste was composted. There was no packaging that couldn't be composted. There was a horse and a cart with two men. One was the filler and one was the carrier. They went round the ash pits, and the filler filled the sack. The carrier carried it to the cart and emptied it. When the cart was full, it was taken to the ash yard on Church Lane. Here it was sorted into coarse or fine ash. The coarse was sold for brick making, and the fine was used in fertiliser. Usually there'd just be a few bones and broken crockery to sift out. What about toilets? The privy, the midden or the closet. That's a posh one, that one. A wooden toilet compartment was made with a board across it with a hole in it and a bucket underneath. During the night, a horse and cart came round, and the bucket was taken through a flap at the back and emptied into the cart. They have a similar system in Russia today. They're called Putins. Yes. The cart was nicknamed the honey cart. The contents of the cart were then taken and emptied into a brick-lined cesspit that was designed to slowly leak into the surrounding ground. That's me when I was younger. When the cesspit became full, a man who was referred to as a gong farmer would empty the pit into a cart using his bare hands, a shovel, a bucket and a ladder. And this was then used as fertiliser, but also it had another use. Can you believe it was used as pig food? It was therefore customary for wealthy people to eat mutton and poor people to eat pork. And compared to other jobs, the gong farmer was very well paid. Now, when my dad was a lad, he lived at the lodge to Dinnington Hall, and they had a toilet with a bucket and a flap. And one day, my dad and my Uncle Chris saw my Auntie Nellie go into the closet. They grabbed a brass rose spray from the garden and filled it with cold water from the water butt. Quietly opened the flap to reveal a full moon protruding through the hole in the board. They gave it a good shot of cold water. Auntie Nellie, with knickers round her ankles, came running out, screaming, "There's a rat in there and it's clung on." But what happened before there was a cart to empty the toilet? A hole was dug and a wooden compartment built over it. A board with a hole was placed at a suitable height over it, and from time to time straw, sawdust and various other suitable materials were added to aid the composting process. In warm weather, bunches of lavender were hung to add a bit of delicacy to the aroma. When it was deemed to be ready, the hole was filled in and another hole dug. The toilet compartment was then simply lifted over it. The best rhubarb was that grown where a hole had been filled in during the previous year. When you leave here tonight, take note as you pass between the two stone gate posts at the side of the driveway. These were originally the entrance gate posts of St. James Church. They were removed and erected at the entrance to this park at the side of Brighton Road, and later resited to where they are now on the driveway. That's the church before the Lich Gate, and they are the gateposts that are in this driveway. And that, yeah, there they are. Right. This is Christmas 1913. And they are the Anston Free Gardeners. And today they would be called the Horticultural Society. In the front there is Mr. Astley Folds. That garden and pond is over in the corner near where the bowling green is. And Mr. Astley built that. Every morning at 5 o'clock he would go and do it on his own before he went to work. I don't think there's anything left to see of it anymore. Now then, we have got some gardeners, I think, tonight. If you're digging in your Anston garden, make sure that all the trunks belong to trees. Now, why would I say that? Well, simply because there is another trunk attached to an elephant that was buried in Anston. So there is an elephant buried in Anston. During the First World War, many horses were commandeered by the army to be used on the battlefield. This caused major problems for many farms. In this area and others, the situation was helped by using circus animals to replace the horses on the farm. Camels, zebras and elephants were some that were used. Elephants farmed the fields of Anston. That's Lizzie, the war elephant. She was known as a war elephant, and she worked at Sheffield Steelworks of Thomas Ward's and others, moving heavy ingots and huge trailers and many other heavy jobs. And there's a plaque to Lizzie, and that is on the Hancock and Lang building on Ladies Bridge. However, the elephant that is buried in Anston was not a war elephant. This one was from a travelling circus that was performing next to the railway line on Mill Lane. The elephant died, well, they wouldn't have buried it if it hadn't died, and it was buried in the field behind that piece of land that the garages used to stand on, after the houses. During the Second World War, a plane crashed in that field, and it was reported as a small German plane. The ridge line along Axel Lane, parallel to the A57, had a number of searchlights sighted on it. The idea was to fool the German pilots into believing that they were flying over Sheffield and hope they would drop their bombs early. Bit harsh for the Anstonians, though. Of course, you've all heard of Bottled Wellwong. You know exactly where that is, yes? No? This is down New Road, previously called Occupation Road, which is a track off Pennypiece Lane, towards the brook. Once it was the Great West Field belonging to the Duke of Leeds. Bottled Wellwong roughly translates to the spring in the marshy bottom of the field, shown in a deed of 1170. On modern OS maps it was named Bott Field. So how did Pennypiece Lane get its name? This is a reference to when the land was divided into strips which were numbered and rented out at a penny per piece. Similarly, Pocket Handkerchief Lane off Todwick Road refers to a small piece of land by the sharp bend on the lane. A pocket of land was not very useful for farming, and a pocket handkerchief was too small to be of much use at all. On Pennypiece Lane there is a row of semi-detached houses, and they were preceded by terraced houses built by the starch manufacturer for his workers. They were therefore called the starch houses. This part of the road was at that time called Starch House Road. There were 3 cottages at right angles to the road at the end of this row by the track that leads up to Quarry Lane. The middle cottage was where the starch was actually manufactured. While we're at Pennypiece Lane, on the corner with Main Street was Ernest Bennett's Saw Doctors, now demolished and replaced by residential housing. During the demolition of the factory, there was a wall at the back with a bricked up recess. When they knocked it down, they found a skeleton of a man with a chain round its neck and a medallion that was engraved. It stated, North Anston Hide and Seek Champion 1965. All right, I lied about the skeleton. On Quarry Lane stands the turret house, actually named the Bungalow. At one time this was nicknamed Margarine Mansion because the owner also had a shop and sold butter. And to make a few extra pennies profit, he mixed cheaper margarine with his butter. The customers soon realised what was going on, and his house quickly gained its new title. On this gate, which is not very visible, but in 1905 this photo shows a name on the gate of Ashley. And on an old map this is also shown as Ashley House. And I think you might want to break now because you've... I can't hear any snoring, but there might be some at the back. So we'll take a break.
Right, then it's over to go again.
You're devils for punishment, aren't you? This is a track through the park, down Nursery Road. In the early days, the only way to get from Anston to Dinnington was via the track that is now the path through the park. All horse-drawn traffic and foot traffic had to use this track. That was the park in 1950, I think. At that time, the track had a slightly different route than today's path. The track passed quite close to the hall at Dinnington and came out below the top of Church Lane, then called Common Lane. All the horse-drawn traffic, and sometimes those going home to Anston after a good session at the Falcon Inn, would be happily singing as they passed the hall. The squire thought that this was an invasion of his privacy, so he decided to build a new road. This new road started at the Green, or Falcon Square in Dinnington, and continued right to the Green in Anston. The whole of that road was called New Road. Later, the long stretch was named Anston Lane or Dinnington Lane, depending on which end you started from. And later still, this was renamed Nursery Road, as it started at the nurseries to the hall at Dinnington end and ended just beyond the nurseries at Anston. The remaining part of the road was, and still is, New Road. The man at the helm is Herbert Hurst. He's laying the first ever metal surface to New Road. And even in the 1930s, village roads were still dirt roads without tarmac surface. Sometimes they had limestone on top. Nursery Road. Along Nursery Road, opposite the park, in 1925, 21 trees were planted at the request of the then deceased squire. This was to celebrate the 21st birthday of his son, Toby Aythorpe. They alternated between lime tree and horse chestnut trees. These trees, therefore, have been there 100 years this year. Today, some of them are missing. One of the horse chestnut trees stands out, and you might have noticed that it has a white painted line round the trunk. This line today has been repainted, but it was originally painted to make that tree more visible during wartime when it was a blackout and vehicles had to have minimal lighting. That's a modern photo. Of course, there were no houses there when the trees were planted, and Anston Lane just ran through the park. That is the back of 91 Nursery Road before Park Avenue was extended into Anston. This was the park in 1950. Until 1949, when I was 3 years old, I lived at the lodge to Dinnington Hall with my parents, as my granddad was a gardener at the hall and lived in the lodge. By the time I was 4, we had moved into a new house on Nursery Road across from the park. In those days it was quite safe for a 4-year-old to be wandering around, except that the park was bounded by barbed wire and it had cows grazing in it. I had a brilliant idea to go into the park through the barbed wire and fetch a calf home for a pet. I hadn't thought about how I would get it out of the park. Of course, I could have been stomped by a cow. Anyway, when my mum came out to check on me, I was already in the park. I was severely reprimanded, which really upset me because I was a good boy, I was. So much so that I ran away from home. I ran away to the fair. When I reached the fair, it wasn't working and I climbed into a dodgem and hid under the rain cover. I should point out that the fair was where Park Avenue Cemetery is now, and only 3 houses away from home. I had been watched all the time and so was reprimanded again. The cemetery wasn't opened until 1953. If you can recognise that along Nursery Road, and pay attention to the little arrow in the bottom right-hand corner. If you're walking from Anston to Dinnington along Nursery Road next to the park, if you know where to look, you will see an interesting piece of history. As you pass opposite Park Avenue and look up to the roundabout, you will see that the road has a steady, long climb. That wasn't always the case. When I was a lad, the road used to be more level, with a short, steep hill from the hall gates up to the junction. At this time, you could see an arched recess into the wall, which was in front of the lodge. It had a trough in the bottom. You can just see that bit of archway today if there's no leaves. It's only just visible, but that is the top of the arched recess. That's how it would have looked, similar to that. It was a drinking trough for the working horses and was called a moat. It is now almost out of sight. It's amazing how much the road has been lifted to ease out the gradient. Horses would have to go to Kiveton Station to collect goods. They would then have to pull the carts up Dog Kennel Hill, then up the steep hill on Brighton Road and back lane. By the time they reached this incline, they had certainly earned a drink. The water flowed into and out of the trough from a spring or moat. It then went under the road and passed under the gardens of the houses opposite, which is why the moat house was given its name. This spring then continued underground down to the backs of the houses on Swinstons Hill Road, and there it surfaced in the field called Water Galls and formed a lake. Now this is the site of Lakeland Drive. In winter, people would skate on the frozen lake until the early hours of the morning with farmers shining their lights of their vehicles. This would be in the 1930s. Harry Dickinson, who lived at the Falcon Hotel, was taught to skate on there by Toby Aythorpe, the Squire's son, in 1936. In those fields, where the lake used to be, we used to go and watch trotting races. I remember going to watch the harness racing, or trotting racing as we called it. This was in Jim Twible's field, which is now the first field on Lakeland Drive, immediately after Turnberry Way. Jim Twible got into trouble with the racing board for allowing trotting racing, and he had to go to London in front of the board. Fortunately, he was allowed to keep his trainer's licence, as it was frowned on for racehorse trainers to be involved in harness racing. And I don't remember any safety helmets either, probably just soft flat caps when we saw it. Opening the cemetery in 1953 at the bottom of Park Avenue. The gentleman with the walking stick in the middle of this photo is John G. John was unfortunate in being the first person to be buried in Park Avenue Cemetery. Ploughing along Rackford Road, 1930s. In a single day, a one-man plough team with a pair of horses would walk 11 miles on the rough ground in order to plough 1 acre, which they were expected to complete as a minimum, on easier ground possibly 1.5 acres. There are some Anston farm workers. Townwell's farm, horse ploughing. Charlie Waring ploughing at Rackford Road in the 1920s. He was working for his brother-in-law, Henry Presswood, of Townwell's farm. Townwell's farm, Elliot's horses ploughing. And Charlie Elliot's cows coming up Rackford Road to go and be milked. Can anybody remember the water tank? Yes. The water tank stood on Woodsets Road, and it led us to nickname that road Tank Lane. It was a landmark that we looked forward to seeing when we returned home from a long journey. The water tank was 50 feet high, and it held 110,000 gallons of water, which would weigh 491 tons. In 1985, it was demolished after 60 years of use. And there's the man on top demolishing it. And there's the house in front of it that was built for the manager of the water board. Near to where the Cutler now stands, but not known exactly, one of the first aircraft to fly over Anston crashed in about 1910. On the photo you can see a large group of onlookers surrounding the biplane. It must have been an amazing sight at that time. Quarrying with a steam crane. This one was in Harry Croft's quarry at South Anston. Quarrymen's tools. And quarrymen to use the tools. And that's how they cut out the blocks of limestone for the Parliament building. That's a lime kiln. Lime kilns were used for burning limestone to make lime for mortar and fertiliser and various other products. There is still one in a garden below Greenlands Park. Sometimes it could take 2 or 3 days just to get them burning properly. I spoke to a lady in Greenlands Park who told me that during the war, her father had to be there at night to make sure that no light escaped from the fire that enemy pilots could see. That is one of the canal barges that took stone from Anston via Chesterfield Canal. And that's one of the Humber sloops that they transferred the stone to at Stockwith Basin. The sloops then transported the stone via the River Trent, River Humber, the North Sea to the building site of the Parliament building. And this is Phyllis, a restored sloop that used to take the stone. These sloops could carry 100 tons each from Stockwith Basin on the River Trent down to the Houses of Parliament. From leaving the quarry, the stone took 14 days to arrive in London. And this is Phyllis today, fully restored. At the quarry, the blocks deemed satisfactory were loaded onto drugs, as they were called, low wooden platforms, the sturdy wheels of which were 18 inches in diameter and 9 inches wide, as carts wouldn't be sturdy enough. Each drug was pulled by 8 horses, 2 miles to Dog Kennels Wharf on the canal summit at Kiveton Park. That's what an 8-horse hitch looks like. But these Clydesdales have an easier load to pull. Once at the canal, the stone had to be sawn into accurate blocks before being loaded onto the narrowboats. More than 900 years ago, Tickhill Castle was built with Anston stone. Over 800 years ago, Roach Abbey was built with Anston stone. And the keep at Conisbee Castle was also built with Anston stone. Back to Main Street. That is the Golden Ball pub. How many of you know the origin of the name, the Blacksmith's Arms? Looking down the steep hill from the green, you would have seen the pub on the left. Its later version, still there today, but converted into apartments. In the 1870s, a gentleman by the name of Jackie Fisher had his public house and blacksmith shop on this site. These original buildings have long since been demolished, but the hill is still named after him, Jackie Fisher's Hill. The original public house was named the Golden Ball, as you can see in this photo. And on the 1840 to 1880 OS maps, both the Golden Ball and the Blacksmith's Arms are on the same map. Golden Ball was further up the slope. In 1834, the price of a pint of ale was very cheap at a halfpenny a pint. Compared to today, using the comparison price index, it would still be very cheap at 16 pence a pint. The Blacksmith's Arms closed in 1966 when the newly built Cutler took over. On the 4th of February 1893, lamps were lit in the streets of Anston for the first time. This one is seen in 1937 at Crogate, and this one at Paradise Square in South Anston, but it was too late for John Wesley. The Cutler was built on the corner of Nursery Road and Woodsets Road, but over the road on the right was the field where the pond named Townend Pond was. This pond was used by farmers to water their animals. We called it Pond Corner for obvious reasons. Seen here on the left is the water cart. This would have been necessary as getting water from the wells would not be possible for everyone. And the next photo is the same photo compared to today. This is a required certificate, and it was written for Arthur Winfrow by Anston Church School to confirm that he was 13 years old and was now exempt from school in order to start work. He couldn't have done it without that certificate. In the early days, before households had electricity and before the gasworks emerged, the options for lighting were paraffin lamps along with the dangers and discomfort, or the more expensive options of candles. A poor third option was just using the firelight. Mr. Albert Turner of South Anston, however, adopted a system for his residence to be illuminated by acetylene gas. The equipment for generating the gas was installed in his outhouse at the rear of the house on West Street, and then piped into each room. The method for producing the gas was to create a reaction between calcium carbide and water. The carbide was stored in pellet form in a container outside the main premises, and water was allowed to drip into it, which produced acetylene gas. The acetylene burned with a brilliant, steady flame, which was superior to coal gas or oil. The cost was a little more expensive than oil, but the benefits outweighed the cost. And Mr. Turner then also arranged for the Wesleyan Chapel to be lit by the same means. At this time, Mr. Jermyn Smith's premises at Westgating Workshop were lit by acetylene, and also the Angel Hotel in Clown, but nowhere else at that time. This experimental system proved to be a success, and the method was later used for vehicle lighting and hand lamps. Now, just diverting back to Dinnington for an interesting piece of history. Let me find my little pointer. That little piece of land there, that is St. Joseph's School, and that's the doctors on New Street. And we're talking about that little piece of land there, and that is Edward Street from Lidget Lane. On Lidget Lane there's a gap between the terrace houses, and it's Edward Street, and it leads to Amen Field. This is a small piece of land that is still untouched today, between St. Joseph's School and the New Street Doctors. Years ago, the house at the inner end of Edward Street had an archway through the middle of the house leading to the field. A horse and carriage could enter the field through it. It was used by entertainers, travelling troops, etc. The circus and the fair came there. It was also the scene of riots, when a threshing machine was placed on it, and the local labourers went to smash it up in the Industrial Revolution in 1830. The original name of the field was Townend Field, but it gained the name of Amen Field because serious criminals were taken there to be tried, and a special judge was brought in from Leeds or York, I forget which. Crowds would gather from surrounding areas. If the accused was found guilty, they were immediately marched down Church Lane, then called Common Lane, and hanged at the gallows at Lawton Common, where the pub now stands. So this little field became Amen Field. This is a diagram of the ice house. This was a brick-built chamber built into the side of the hill that is now a small wooded area between Limelands Estate on Church Lane and Devonshire Drive in Anston. It is a remaining part of the old alcove plantation. Ice houses were only used by the very rich and so were quite rare. The ice house had access at the top and a door at the side down some steps. It was used to store ice for use at Dinnington Hall throughout the year, as there was no refrigerators at that time. Ice was used to aid fevers, etc., and in the kitchen for food preservation. The way that it worked was very simple. During the winter months, the fishing ponds down Church Lane would freeze over. All the labourers would go and break up the ice and load it onto a horse-drawn cart. This was then taken with snow, if available, to the ice house and loaded through the top. Straw was placed between the layers, then water was heated over a fire and poured onto the ice. This caused it to form a solid mass, but with straw creating layers. When the ice was required for the hall, someone would go to the ice house and use the side door as access and chop out the required amount with an axe or a saw. And as the year progressed, he would need a ladder to get down to the ice inside. This was similar to our local one, but our access was down some steps at the entrance. Now we're in Dinnington. This is Mrs. Brewer at her front door onto Lawton Road. This building is now Nathan Guy Hair Salon. All this area below Hall Farm, Twyvels, was a farm croft that had been bought from Squire Aythorpe by a farmer, William Presley from Anston, in the 1700s. He eventually sold it in small lots, and cottages were built on those lots. Cottages required access, so the lane was built to service the cottages. And as it had been part of the croft where the barley was stored, it was named Barleycroft Lane. You'll be getting dizzy in a minute, we're going back to Anston. Magilla. Magilla was named after a place in Africa where the builder's brother was a missionary. And there it was, Tanzania. Almost 5,000 miles from our little community. And that is the village in Tanzania. At the very end of the row of houses in Anston was a very large hut which was called the Mission Hut. A few pictures of Magilla. And that's exactly where the dumpit site is now. And that just shows Magilla at the bottom, Cranfit in the middle, starch houses at the top. That is the corner of a field near Thwaite Wood, which is down Lays Lane from Dinnington. In that corner, someone found a hoard of mother of pearl. Obviously, it would not have been there unless it had been transported in. So this stems from Roman times and links to jewellery making. This was probably where someone's dwelling stood and where he carried out his jewellery making trade. Now you'll all be relieved to know that this little story is just to round things off before we say good night. There's one little story that I'd like to tell you, and it relates to Townwells Farm and Anston Working Men's Club. I had a friend called Dan who collected and restored old tractors. Charlie Elliott let him keep them in a building at the farm. Dan was always fiddling with his tractors and polishing them. If you needed to find Dan, the first place you would look was the tractor shed. They looked better than new. Sadly, Dan became ill, and eventually he had to be permanently in a wheelchair. He became very depressed because he couldn't see to his tractors. And I suggested that it might be better for him if he just sold them all. At least he'd know that somebody would be looking after them. I offered to help find a buyer, but before I could, another friend had heard about it and told a contact who agreed to buy Dan's whole collection, which he did. Now, Dan liked to go to the club at the weekend, and so I offered to wheel him there on Saturday nights. That's what it was like in those days in pubs and clubs. You could smoke in pubs and clubs, and sometimes the air was so blue you couldn't see the other side of the room. And you went home with your eyes stinging and your clothes smelling of tobacco smoke. I would wheel Dan to his favourite table and go to the bar and get the drinks. And I noticed that after a while, the air did seem clearer. And it happened every time we went in. And I thought about this for quite some time. And one day I was sitting in the garden having a coffee when it suddenly dawned on me why the air was clearing when we were in there. Dan was an ex-tractor fan. You shouldn't clap, you're waking everybody up. There you are, ladies and gentlemen, that's my little donation.
Thank you very much.
Well, you've learned a bit about Anston, didn't you, haven't you?
Yeah, absolutely.
I think it's worth putting your hands together for it.